In 1800, Washington, D.C. was barely a city at all. It was a bold experiment carved from swampland and forest, a collection of scattered buildings connected by muddy roads, surrounded by wilderness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The nation's new capital existed more as an idea than a reality, a symbol of American ambition planted in what many considered an impossible location. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic paintings, maps, and sketches to life, allowing us to shift perspective, move through these scenes, and experience the early capital in ways the original artists never imagined. We'll walk the rutted streets, stand in the half-built government buildings, and witness a city struggling to become worthy of a new republic's dreams. Before we step into this emerging capital, it helps to understand what we're looking at. This wasn't the Washington, D.C. we know today, with its grand monuments and bustling neighborhoods. This was a place where congressmen complained about the isolation, where foreign diplomats questioned whether America was serious about governing itself, and where the very idea of a permanent seat of government hung in the balance. The story begins with this view of the Potomac River as it appeared in the final years of the 18th century. Wide, slow-moving waters cutting through dense forests and scattered clearings, with only the faintest signs of human settlement visible along its banks. This river would become the lifeline of the new capital, carrying supplies, visitors, and the weight of a nation's hopes toward a place that barely existed. Standing on these banks in 1800, you might have wondered whether the grand plans would ever come to pass. The location had been chosen through political compromise, a deal that balanced northern and southern interests while satisfying no one completely. What lay ahead was a test of whether democracy could build something lasting from nothing but vision and determination. This sketch shows the earliest survey of the federal district, a geometric pattern imposed on rolling hills and wetlands that had never known such ambition. The lines on paper represented streets that existed only in imagination, blocks that were still thick forest, and a future that seemed both inevitable and impossible. Pierre L'Enfant's grand design called for broad avenues radiating from central points, creating a city unlike anything America had ever attempted. But between the vision and reality lay an enormous gap. The surveyors who walked these lands faced swamps that bred mosquitoes and disease, hills that would need to be leveled, and creeks that would require bridging. Every line on their maps represented months of backbreaking work in conditions that tested human endurance. Here we see the president's house as it appeared in its earliest days, still under construction and surrounded by the debris of ongoing work. What would later be known as the White House stood incomplete and isolated, its walls rising from a landscape that looked more like a construction site than the seat of executive power. Workers moved stone and timber along paths that would someday become Pennsylvania Avenue. But in 1800, this was simply a house being built in the middle of nowhere. The building itself represented everything ambitious and uncertain about the new capital. Its design drew inspiration from European palaces, yet it sat in a wilderness that reminded visitors of America's frontier character. Foreign diplomats arriving for official business often expressed surprise at the modest scale and unfinished state of what was meant to be the symbol of American authority. Moving through the early city, we encounter scenes like this view of the Capitol building in its first incarnation. Only the north wing had been completed when Congress first met here in November 1800, creating a structure that looked more like a large house than the seat of national government. The dome that would later define the building's silhouette existed only in architectural drawings, leaving visitors to imagine what the finished structure might become. Inside these walls, representatives and senators gathered to conduct the business of a nation still defining itself. The rooms were cramped, the acoustics poor, and the facilities basic, yet the debates that took place here would shape the future of American democracy. The building's unfinished state seemed to mirror the country itself, full of potential, but still very much under construction. This image captures the essence of early Washington's challenge. Pennsylvania Avenue stretching between the president's house and the Capitol, a grand boulevard that existed more in theory than practice. The road was often impassable in wet weather, turning to mud that could trap carriages and discourage all but the most determined travelers. Yet this avenue represented the heart of L'Enfant's vision, a ceremonial pathway connecting the executive and legislative branches of government. Walking this route in 1800 meant navigating around tree stumps, construction materials, and the occasional wandering livestock, all while trying to imagine the magnificent city this was meant to become. The few buildings that did exist along this route told the story of a capital caught between ambition and reality. Scattered boarding houses offered cramped quarters for congressmen who had no choice but to endure primitive conditions during legislative sessions. These temporary structures, hastily built from local timber, housed the men responsible for governing a growing nation. Yet they resembled frontier accommodations more than dignified residences for national leaders. Georgetown, just a few miles upstream, offered a striking contrast to the emerging federal district. This established port town had been thriving for decades, its streets lined with substantial brick buildings, busy wharves, and the accumulated prosperity of tobacco and flour trade. Visitors arriving by boat often stopped first in Georgetown, where they could find proper lodging and civilized amenities before venturing into the wilderness that would supposedly become America's capital. The contrast was jarring. Georgetown represented the established order of colonial commerce, while the federal district embodied the uncertain promise of Republican government. Many questioned whether abandoning the comfort and infrastructure of existing cities for this bold experiment made any sense at all. This view shows the early development around what is now Foggy Bottom, then a collection of modest dwellings and workshops scattered along the Potomac's edge. The area earned its name from the mist that rose from the river and nearby marshlands, creating an atmosphere that seemed to blur the line between land and water, between the real and the imagined. Here, craftsmen and laborers who were building the capital made their homes in simple structures that could be erected quickly and cheaply. These weren't the grand residences that planners envisioned for the future city, but practical shelters for the people doing the actual work of construction. The gap between democratic ideals and daily reality was visible in every ramshackle building and muddy lane. Moving toward the eastern branch of the Potomac, we encountered the Navy Yard in its earliest form. This facility represented one of the few concrete achievements of the new capital, a working installation that served both practical and symbolic purposes. Ships could be built and repaired here, but more importantly, the yard demonstrated that the federal government was serious about establishing a permanent presence in this location. The workers at the Navy Yard came from diverse backgrounds, including skilled shipwrights from Baltimore and Philadelphia, who brought expertise to this remote outpost. Their presence added a note of professionalism to what many still considered an amateur undertaking, proving that serious work could be accomplished in this unlikely setting. Looking back at Washington, D.C. in 1800, we see the raw ambition of a young nation willing to build its future from nothing but swampland and hope. Through these reconstructed scenes, we've walked streets that barely existed and stood in buildings that were more promise than reality. Thanks for joining this journey into America's uncertain beginning. If there's another historic city or moment you'd like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments.